guys, it's Quinlan. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you another video, and this time, if you can probably tell from the title, it's like my experience with adult fiction, kind of. At the beginning of this year, I thought I would be cool, and I got a couple of kind of like adult, like contemporary fiction books. I obviously already love YA, but I kind of wanted to branch out and see if adult was like more of my speed, because I guess something that I do really love is obviously Sarah J. Maas, and some of her kind of later books are definitely more like adult, and I know they're obviously adult fantasy, which is very different from kind of adult contemporary fiction, but I thought it would be interesting to kind of delve into that world where they're more kind of like real about like life and what things are about. And I do think that if I wanted to delve into the adult fiction world, I maybe shouldn't have started with like adult contemporary fiction, because I don't think maybe that was the best place for me to start. But I did want to talk about the two books that I read this year so far that were adult contemporary fiction, and then just like kind of my overall experience. I think adult contemporary fiction is honestly super depressing. Like, I wouldn't consider YA contemporary my favorite genre, though I have read like maybe not a considerable amount, but I have read a couple of YA. I tend to lean more towards like YA fantasy and stuff like that, and even like sci-fi. But my experience with YA contemporary has been kind of mixed. I think a lot of the YA contemporary I read is like romance, although I did read All the Bright Places, which was pretty sad. But something that I just noticed about like contemporary adult fiction is that it always has such a depressing outlook on like life, and especially marriage. I feel like they always make marriage, like they take all of the magic out of like romance basically, and it is really sad. And I understand that there is a realistic component where people often do fall out of love, and obviously they get together when they're young, and then when they're old they may grow apart, or they may become very frustrated with each other, or they lose their communication skills, and just a lot of things happen. And I understand that being in a relationship is not all like peaches and cream, but I do feel like you could portray it in a more fun, realistic way instead of like completely being depressing, because I do feel like that's kind of the vibe I get from these books. So now I'm going to talk about the two books that I read, one of which I actually enjoyed and one of which I actually really didn't enjoy. And I will get into the spoilers, but I will talk about them a little bit more broadly first, and I will leave timestamps in the description in case you just want to skip over my spoilers. So the first book of contemporary adult fiction that I read was Recipe for a Perfect Wife by Karma Brown, and this is the one that I really did not like, and I talked a little bit about it in one of my wrap-up videos, I believe. I think it was my March wrap-up. And it's basically about this woman who has decided to become kind of a housewife named Alice, and so her husband's now like the sole moneymaker in the family, and she's trying to write a novel. And it also parallels the story of Nellie, who's a housewife in the 1950s, so obviously very different circumstances, and her husband is pretty horrible to her, and it kind of parallels the two women's lives. And Alice ends up finding a bunch of an old recipe book of Nellie's, and so their lives are kind of connected that way, although not completely. So it is an interesting concept, and I thought I would really enjoy it because I kind of love a little bit of historical fiction. I also just felt like I would really enjoy reading, I don't know, just like a book about like housewives and like get a new perspective. I don't know, like I've never read a book about that, so I thought it would be interesting, and just the plot sounded interesting in general, though I didn't know a lot. But it ended up being super depressing. Both of the marriages were not optimal. I'll just say that. And I kind of went into it thinking it would be more of like a happy kind of like, I don't know, I just thought it would be happier, but instead it made me depressed, and it made me sad about marriage and life, and that's kind of how I feel. And I'm going to get into the spoilers, so if you haven't read Recipe for a Perfect Housewife, don't continue watching, but I will leave a timestamp in the description below to know when the spoilers are over, so that you can continue on with the video. So for Recipe for a Perfect Wife, I really didn't like this book. I kind of want to say I hated it, and that was because, if you've read it, because we're in the spoilers now, Alice just keeps lying for like no reason to her husband. She could easily talk to him about not wanting a kid, and instead she goes and gets an IUD without like telling him at all. And I understand her body, her choice, like I respect that, but it doesn't mean that you should lie to your husband about that and pretend you're trying for a baby when you're not. And all in all, I just felt like it was horrible. And then I felt like they should get a divorce at the end, but instead of getting a divorce because they both were lying to each other the entire time, they had to stick together because all of a sudden she got pregnant. It was just like a horrible idea of like what a marriage could be, and obviously the marriage like went downhill because they both lied to each other. And then I felt like they had to stay together because she got pregnant and she was like using her pregnancy to hold power over him because she had his baby inside of her, which I just thought was so horrible, like, and manipulative. I hated Alice. I hated her husband. I actually did like Nellie's story. I thought that was probably the best part of the whole thing. It was kind of fun to just like see what her life was like in the 1950s. It was kind of lonely and sad, I do feel like, but she did kill her husband, so girl power, I don't know. Anyways, I just had so many bad feelings about this book, and it just put an icky taste in my mouth because, of course, I hated Nellie's husband, obviously, but I felt like their story was more compelling and interesting, whereas Alice and Nate were just lying to each other, and they just had a horrible marriage, and then she manipulated him, and it was just horrible, and so I just hated it. So yeah, that was my first kind of depressing adult contemporary experience, and this did really put me off adult contemporary, but I'd already bought the book that I'm about to talk about, so I was kind of like, I have to read it. Next book that I read was The Most Fun We Ever Had by Claire Lombardo, and I haven't talked about this yet because I actually finished it last night, and I have this kind of weird system where I have like a backup book normally that I have. So I have a book that I'm like primarily reading. I have an audiobook that I'm listening to, and then I have a backup book. And when I talk about my backup book, it's usually a book that I'm not really enjoying so much, and I'm having trouble like reading a bunch of it at one time and just like sitting down and reading it like I do with a lot of my other books. So I use it as a backup, so every couple of books that I read, maybe like every time I finish one of my primary books, I have to read like 50 to 100 pages of my backup book. So this I actually brought on a trip with me around the same time that I read House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas and Love Boat Taipei, if you watched my March wrap up. And I brought this with me and I started to read it because it was the only other book that I had, but we got home before I finished it and I kept trying to read it and I just wasn't vibing with it. I didn't like it at all. But then more recently I started to pick it up again and I ended up really enjoying it. The problem was I have mixed feelings on this book because I did really enjoy it, but again, I feel like it was super depressing. It had a super depressing outlook on life, and not just because depressing things happened to the characters, but because like all of their relationships kind of fell apart and they were kind of terrible to each other, and I just felt like maybe this is realistic, but is this really what adulthood is like? Like, that just seems so sad and depressing, and I look at my mom and I don't feel like she's like completely like any of the characters in this book, so I just felt like maybe it was a little bit too much in terms of like how horrible the relationships were and how strained they were. And so I genuinely just had kind of like mixed feelings, but it did have a better like ending in my opinion than Recipe for a Perfect Housewife, so I ended up kind of enjoying it overall, I would say. And I would actually recommend it if you're into adult contemporary, but if you're not, I wouldn't, because it does make you a little bit depressed, I have to say. Before I jump into spoilers, I just have to say I hated The Oldest $2 so much. I despise them absolutely for different reasons, but they just got on my nerves so much. But now I'm going to jump into the spoilers, so if you haven't read it, go ahead and skip. I'll have the timestamp again below in the description. If you guys have read this book, I feel like you'll know what I'm talking about. Just like even Marilyn and David, whose relationship is almost perfect from the outside, you realize it's not perfect, and you realize that like they're kind of not quite falling out of love, but like their relationship is not strong like it used to be, and it's not as passionate, and it just, like, the inevitability of like the deterioration of marriage is just such a sad concept. And I feel like when you read books for escape, this is not what you're looking for. Definitely I wanted something like fun and like, oh, this is like a fun family novel. No. All of the people are like horrible and hate each other, and all I have to say about this is like I hated Wendy. Like, I don't care how much tragedy your life like has been through, like I hated her so much. Like, she is so selfish, such a brat. She's not hardworking at all. She has no work ethic. She got lucky marrying someone rich, and so she doesn't have to do any work, but she never really intended to do work in the first place. And it was just all too much for me. Like, I just genuinely hate her. And every time she's in a conversation, she always has to like butt in and say something rude and horrible, and then like she always has to guilt trip people for having like better lives because like for her husband and her daughter died. And I understand that it's really hard, but I feel like there are so many better ways you can deal with grief and tragedy than how this is portrayed. Because I mean, I'm not going to say I know someone who has had this exact experience, but I know people who have had, like, tried to have children and have failed, or have lost their significant other, or have actually, I know someone who's lost their significant other and their child, and they're not horrible and, like, evil and constantly degrading everybody for, like, having a better life and, like, cursing the stars and then just like doing nothing, and she's just horrible. And then again, she abandoned Jonah. She's like totally selfish. She wasn't ready to be a parent. It just, she just made me want to punch her. Like, I really just want to punch her. If I could go on this book, I would absolutely go in and give her a piece of my mind. I would slap her senseless because she just frustrates me so much. And then Violet, I ended up not hating her as much, but definitely towards the middle of the book, I ended up really disliking her because she was like totally like kind of abandoning her entire family and just being very self-centered, and it just frustrated me. I understand she has like mental health problems, but I don't know, when she was in the right frame of mind, she just wasn't treating her husband or her kids, or especially Jonah, right. And I just, she just frustrated me. But mostly Wendy. And especially their relationship, Wendy and Violet's relationship, is so toxic and so annoying. And I feel like the author tried to portray them as just having like this like unspoken bond, and like they don't have to apologize to each other. Like, they're sisters, they're Irish twins. She could not stop saying Irish twins. And I just felt like, we get it, like they're sisters and they're both the oldest and they were born very close together, and so, you know, but Wendy needs to stop being salty about that, and Violet just needs to take a chill pill. Like, everybody needs to calm down. Violet needs to see a therapist, maybe Wendy does too. I just couldn't deal with it. That is kind of, I feel like that's my main thoughts, which is weird because I haven't really talked about the plot or anything. I just felt like it was sad because they all just had such miserable lives, and they all like had things, like even Grace, who seemed like she had an okay life. No, it turned out she had a bad life and she was lying to her parents, and I just felt like that whole plot point was like completely unnecessary. In fact, Grace wasn't even really a necessary character. I felt like she was very much unnecessary. Liza, a little bit more so, but it was just terrible. And then I felt like Marilyn and David, I was really interested in. I loved seeing the flashbacks. I thought those were a lot of fun, especially to like the early years of their marriage. I thought that was so much fun, and like getting to know them and stuff like that. But it was kind of sad to see like their marriage falling apart, because I mean ultimately they're together and they're happy, but it's just they don't love each other like they used to, and it's just kind of sad to see. But those are kind of my thoughts on that book. Okay, so if you stuck around, or even if you skipped around, thank you guys so much for watching. I just wanted to overall kind of explain that I feel like adult contemporary, like, I feel like people who read more like adult books often feel like they're a little bit better than people who read YA. And I understand the appeal of reading like an older protagonist, because I'll admit, like, I am reading a book that my brother kind of recommended to me, and the protagonist is really young, although I'm not sure exactly how old. And even protagonists that are like my age, I'm 17. I know I don't look 17, but I am 17, I promise. even reading book characters that are like 16 and 17, like my age, I do feel like that's very young, especially to be doing a lot of the things that they're doing. And while obviously I have the mindset to know that like 17-year-olds can be pretty mature, I do feel like some of the things that they go through are really intense. So but I'm also kind of thinking forward, I guess I'm trying to say, and I do feel like the older I get, the less likely I am going to want to read a much younger protagonist than I am. I think I'll still enjoy it because like my mom still reads some of the books that I read and she still enjoys them, but I do feel like it's more fun to read a protagonist that's like your age or older. So that's why I was kind of interested in adult fiction, and maybe I'll check out like adult fantasy next, and definitely leave any books down below that you recommend in the comments. But I just feel like people who read adult generally, I get the vibe that they think that they have like a superior reading taste because YA is often considered like trashy or like unintellectual, but I think YA can have some super real themes, and I think it can honestly change people's lives, and it was a big part of my life growing up, so I do feel like it can have a really big impact on you. Even if it's not the most intellectual book, it can still have a deep emotional impact on you, and I think that's what matters. And I do feel like a lot of the books do have some really powerful themes, so I don't feel like reading adult fiction makes you any cooler, and I genuinely think that a lot of the adult contemporary books are just depressing because they have such like a miserable outlook on like life and marriage. And yes, they keep it real, but a lot of the times we read books to find escape. And yes, books that like have tragedy where protagonists like suffer from terrible events and have to deal with the aftermath, they're very meaningful, but usually they make us grateful for what we have. Like when the protagonist loses loved ones, it makes us grateful for what we have, whereas this is just too real in a sense, and it's not really a form of escapism. That's just kind of how I feel on adult fiction. And just really what I'm trying to say is I don't feel like adult fiction is any like more intellectual than YA. Like I feel like YA can be just as powerful and poignant. And yeah, that's kind of all I have to say. It kind of took me till the end of this video to really get like my point out there, so I'm a little bit sorry, but thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.